Hi, my name is Peter Watts, and so I'm going to share a brief timeline of my church experience. So I grew up in a traditional Black Baptist church in the city of Watts. It was my family's church where my grandfather was the head deacon, head of the deacon board. My family was very much a part of that church. Aunts and uncles, ushers, deacons, choir members, and also ministers at that church. We soon after left that church when I was in middle school, and my uncle planted a church with the Calvary Chapel movement. So I was part of the Calvary Chapel Jesus movement in middle school, and we were part of that church from my middle school to high school years. And it was one of the first predominantly African American Calvary chapels, if not the first black Calvary chapel in the country. And right around about the Watts riot, not the Watts riots, but the LA riots, we moved to the city of Compton, where we are Calvary Chapel of Compton. And during that time, during the riots, there were a lot of break-ins in the church. And so my uncle, who planted that church, said that he felt called to Oceanside. So he ended up leaving, and he and his family, my aunt and uncle and cousins, moved to Oceanside. And so I was without a church for a little while. When I got into college, I met my wife and joined her church, which was a traditional Black Baptist church, and was with that church, and that's when I actually received my call into ministry. So I was called into ministry at that church in Compton, and was with that church for about 7, 8 years, and was licensed and ordained as a minister and preacher. And had been doing ministry there again for about 7, 8 years, and just felt called to plant a church in about 2005. And so left that church, and by God's providence ended up being a part of a church plant that was part of the Reformed Church of America. So that was part of the Reformed tradition. So ended up becoming a part of that church, and ended up planting a church out of that church in the city of Carson, a multi-ethnic church. My wife and I in about 2007, 2008. And so I've been a part of the Reformed Church of America for the past almost 10 years now. And so when we look at my timeline in terms of my church history and church role throughout my life, as a congregant when I was a young kid, and then as a leader when I received my call into ministry, was teaching Bible study, Sunday school, couples ministry, young adult ministry, and then became the youth pastor at that church in Compton. And then to being the actual lead pastor of the church I currently pastor, the church plant that we planted over 8 years ago. So that's kind of the history. And the most meaningful formative Christian experience, I would say, that I have that comes to mind was that time when I had been called into ministry, where my pastor at that time really spent quality time with his ministerial staff in formative work that we were doing with regards to our formative development and our Christian ministry and our ministry that God had called us to specifically. And what Christian community has been formative in my life, I would have to say that the ministry that I'm a part of now, which is World Impact, which is a Christian missions, domestic missions organization, has really been formative to me in a way that is quite different from just my background when it comes to rule of life, rhythm of life, doing Lectio Divina, listening prayers, like all of these different things that were actually foreign to me with my church background and spiritual heritage, has really been formative for me in my life, in this season of my life, and ministry. And then lastly, the books that have been most influential, and authors and people probably have been Tim Keller and his book City Church, and then some books that aren't really about ecclesiology, but just about development and personal development and leadership development. Also was this book by Jim Collins called Good to Great. And then the most significant experience of wounding and or healing in Christian community, probably would say the season that we are in right now, or even just coming out of, with the death of a really close friend of mine who was part of our church, who was part of my school when we started our school, who was part of this church when we started our church, and just seeing how God's hand has been with us through his death, and how we've come together as a church and as a family to really see God's hand of grace and mercy throughout this whole process. So that is my spiritual autobiography, and I hope you enjoyed it.